Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Esther Zimmerman, author, professor, and impassioned global advocate for children. What's our responsibility to care for and disciple the emerging generation? Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of the Association for Biblical Higher Education. And our guest this week is Esther Zimmerman. And Esther is somebody that I have known for a number of years. We worked together as colleagues several years at the Lancaster Bible College. She's still there and doing some incredible work in the area of children's ministry, not just here in the States, but really from a global perspective. And I think sometimes in our realities, especially in higher education, we live in our silos and forget that there's an entire world out there. And Esther has really been on the cutting edge of taking a look at what the needs are globally for children. And it's eye-opening when you consider the contexts where children are around the world, third world contexts, but then also children here in the United States. So I invited her in to just kind of share from her experiences, why she's so passionate about this and kind of the state of where children's ministry is and what can we do, both in higher education as well as within our communities to address the issues related to children's ministry and making them a priority. So welcome to the show, Esther.
Thanks so much for having me, Philip.
Absolutely. So get us started just by talking about you and why is this such an area of passion for you, children's ministries globally?
Yeah, thank you. So I was reflecting on that this week and realized that some of the reasons that I stepped into children's ministry are really different from the reasons that have kept me in children's ministry. So I graduated from a conservative evangelical Bible college in the early 1990s. And as a woman with a passion for teaching and leadership, children's ministry was simply the place where there were open doors in that season. But as I reflect on why I've stayed in children's ministry, because there's been other open doors since then, I think it's because I've become convinced that it's the most strategic place I can invest my life for the kingdom of God. As I think about children in our world, there's simply so many of them. There's over 2 billion children. 1 in every 4 people on our planet's a child under the age of 15. When I look at Barna's research, children have largely formed their worldview by age 13, which is just about the time where churches start taking them seriously. And then on top of all that, you start to look at scripture and you begin to notice just how deeply seriously God takes children in their spiritual development. And that's why I've stayed.
Yeah. So then it was path of least resistance, or it was something that was just available, open doors, and God then used that in your life as a catalyst to kind of propel you to really make this a part of who you are. What are some of the organizations that you've been a part of in those years related to children's ministry?
Yeah, so for many years, I served with BCM or Bible-Centered Ministries.
Yep.
I was there for 13 years as International Children's Ministry Director, and I've remained involved even with the transition into higher education through the Global Children's Forum. So GCF is a partnering network that was born out of the Lausanne movement and works broadly across various organizations in the World Evangelical Alliance.
Yeah. Are you seeing, you're obviously in biblical higher education now, and you oversee a number of different programs at LBC. One of those being children's ministry. What's been the ebbs and flows of colleges offering specific majors related to children's ministry?
I think it's always been challenging because I think there's a perception that says we don't actually need to know much to teach children. So it can be a hard sell for churches to really recognize that the people who are dealing with our children need equipping just as much as the people dealing with their adults. At the same time, I'm encouraged that more people are talking about children. There's a long way to go, though.
Yeah. My bias that I probably should mention is that my wife, Amy, served in children's ministry for a number of years at our church, experienced some of that perception of children's ministry is just babysitting so that the adults can go to main service. That's an overgeneralization, but sometimes that's at the core of it. And yet there's tremendous opportunity to minister. Talk to us a little bit about the difference of what you see in children's ministry in the United States, or perhaps from a Western perspective, versus the rest of the world.
I think some of the challenges are common across continents. Certainly within both BCM and Global Children's Forum, we work across all the continents. And I think there's shared this perception that children's ministry, as you called it, is babysitting. I remember a conversation I had with a children's ministry leader in Nairobi about 15 years ago now. I was there with Biblica doing a week of training, and she had come and she was sharing with me a little bit about her ministry situation. I was asking her, how many children do you have? She says, oh, we've got about 150 children on a Sunday morning. So that's wonderful. What ages are they? She said, well, they're everywhere from newborn to age 13. I said, wow, that's quite a spread. And how many leaders do you have? And I remember she looked at the lady sitting next to her and she says, oh, it's just the two of us. And I remember looking at her and just saying, what can I do that would help you? And her answer stuck with me through the years. She said, help our pastors understand that what we do matters. I think that shows up in various ways in different parts of the world, certainly in the West. A lot of churches have significant budgets for children's ministry, but when those budgets are directed primarily towards entertaining children or making sure that families feel their children are safe, rather than being laser focused on the discipleship of children, I think we've actually missed God's heart altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. My daughter's involved. She was part of a church in a small group, and the perspective of the small groups were to, when she was in elementary school, be in the small group, and they tracked that group all the way through from elementary school to college or high school graduation. And one of the neatest stories is that Michaela, that was so impressive to her and imprinted her life, that when she graduated from high school, started her own group of girls. And I think they were either in 4th or 5th grade. I think it's this year they all graduate from high school, and they've been together. And you talk about a rich experience of being able to pour into the lives of young ladies for that long of a stretch of time. Michaela was different as a result of it, and these young ladies are going to be different. And it's such an opportunity we have that shapes the next generation of Christ followers, and the modeling that happens then, so that they then see the value of investing time and energy in ministering to other children.
Absolutely, because discipleship has only ever happened through people. We don't disciple by programs or by curriculum or by technology. People disciple people or don't.
This is kind of maybe an obvious question, but I think one that we have to address. You gave some statistics about some of the numbers. Did you say one in 4 in the world is a child?
Yeah.
So 25% of the world's population are classified as children. Yeah. Children are vulnerable, right? They a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, all the way up through whatever age, are dependent on the adults around them. They're not physically, mentally, emotionally able to handle the things of the world. So parenting is involved with that. They're a vulnerable group. It's only natural that we think, well, because they're vulnerable, therefore we create safe spaces for them to grow up and flourish. That doesn't necessarily happen. So why is that?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is sin, isn't it? But as I think about God's design for our children and young people, it was always for their flourishing. I think God's heart was that every child would grow up surrounded by a family that would love, teach, nurture, protect, that every family in turn would be surrounded by a faith community that would support and encourage and equip, and that even the faith community would be surrounded by this broader community of justice that reflected God's righteousness and goodness for children and families. And as Cornelius Planting has reminded us, the world is just not the way it's supposed to be. And I think as we look at those structures that God intended to be for the flourishing of children, those structures themselves are broken. And children sit at the bottom of the weight of sin that exists in every one of those levels. Dan Brewster was a a child advocate that worked for years with Compassion International, and he observed at one point, he says, in a sense, children pay for the sins of adults. And that's always stuck with me, that when brokenness reigns, those that are most vulnerable feel the effects most keenly. And in every society, our own included, that's children.
Yeah. Yeah. And you layer into that economic situations and third world situations and access to resources situations, which only then makes those who are vulnerable that much more vulnerable, as if they weren't already in a bad position. I had a guest on several weeks ago who works with sexual exploitation. So she's an attorney. Kristen Price does fascinating work in this area. And she gave an amazing statistic. It was somewhere between 80 to 90%. I don't remember the exact one, but they've done their research of child sexual exploitation happens within the context of families where it's actually known and children are prostituted out. Boy, the gravity of that just really hits hard.
The world's always been a broken place for children. And I think one of the things that encourages me is that the Bible's incredibly honest about it. The Bible's never thought to sugarcoat the reality of a broken world for children. And when I think about the children we encounter in Scripture, they're dealing with genocide, they're dealing with slavery, they're dealing with sexual exploitation, they're dealing with family dysfunction. And yet, in the midst of that, God Himself is still at work. And I think even of some of the specific children that we encounter in the pages of Scripture, not only are they profoundly at risk, but God is in the middle of their world, reaching in over through the obstacles to meet them where they are and to use them as a part of His kingdom story.
Yeah, yeah. You see a lot globally. We've touched on it a little bit, but when you pull back and take a look at generalizations of children's ministry, let's do it in two categories. One, what are you seeing that troubles you? But then on the positive side, what are you seeing that's encouraging you?
I continue to be haunted by the words of that Kenyan children's leader that says, help our pastors understand that what we do matters. This urgency to disciple the next generation, that they would know, love, and obey God with their whole hearts for their whole lives. There's a lot at stake, Philip, and I'm not sure as a church we've grasped the gravity of the challenge that we're facing. So I have a friend, Dr. Mark Griffiths, who leads an MA program in children and family with the Church of Wales. He wrote a book a number of years ago called One Generation from Extinction. And it's an intentionally provocative title. But I think what he's getting at is that idea from Judges that there arose a generation who knew not the Lord nor what He had done. And I'm not a futurist. I've got friends who are wonderful futurists, but what I am is European, and it's not difficult to look back on the last couple of generations of children in our context and begin to realize what happens when over time we neglect the serious discipleship of our children and young people. So 1910, there was a census done of child church engagement in the UK. And at that time, 85% of children were involved in a weekly church engagement. So that was 1910. 2010, 100 years later, that a similar survey was done, and the engagement at that point was 4%. So in 100 years, we went from 85% church engagement to 4% in church engagement, and it's stayed around there for the last 15 years. I believe it's where American churches are going, and going quite quickly, unless something happens to reverse the trend.
Those numbers are staggering. And you put that with where we are in the world, increased secularism, and wonder are these direct results of our lack of engagement of taking care of the children, discipling children. They become adults and continue that cycle away from the church. And I think it's an opportunity for us. So before we all get really negative and throw in the towel and say, all right, well, it's worthless. If only 4% are going, it is what it is. What are you seeing that's positive?
And there's a lot to celebrate. I believe that the children are more on the church's radar now than they were 20 years ago when I began this journey. I see a lot more conversation about children. One of the things I loved in the recent ABHE conference was hearing one of the plenary session speakers from the platform just talk about his love for children, his serious investment in them. And that was beautiful. I don't know if that would have happened 25 years ago. So I see a lot of signs of encouragement. I think there's more ministries that are focused on children. I think those ministries are doing a better job of dreaming and partnering together than they used to. They're breaking out of silos. And everywhere I go, I meet these amazing, dedicated, grassroots level, on the ground children's leaders that are just sacrificially investing for the sake of children. And it's ministry in the trenches. The results of the investment, they may not be seen for decades, but they're there and they're just steadily, faithfully doing what God's called them to do.
Yeah. I don't remember the source or the statistics, so I won't pretend that I won't throw up a shocking statistic. Like I said, Amy worked in this space, and she shared with me that here in the U.S., one of the main reasons why adults engage back in church as adults is when they have children. And there's, whether their sense is out of sense of guilt or who knows what, coming back to church, one of the reasons adults come back to church is because they want some form of spiritual formation for their children, even though they really don't even know what it is that they think that they want, as one of the reasons why they're coming back to church, which I think and I don't know if that's a global phenomenon, but certainly here in the U.S. it is, which all the more gives reason why your children's ministry within the context of the church ought to just be the best thing of the church. If the reason is the children, then the children are going to want to come back, and therefore that's reason for the adults to come back.
I think that's a pattern that we're seeing, that the statistics of young people leaving the church are pretty horrific.
Mm-hmm.
But the counterpoint statistic is those families that are coming back. But I think it's important that we recognize what it is that's drawing them back, because there's a lot of places they can take their children to be occupied, to be entertained, but they're hungry for something that's deeper. Hungry for a relationship with Jesus, and the sense that their children are spiritual beings and that needs to be nurtured. And what an incredible opportunity we have as a church.
Yeah. Step into it, right? This is a systemic issue. Vulnerability of children globally, 85% church engagement down to 4% over 100 years. I mean, if there's ever a systemic problem, that's it. And at times, our response to systemic problems is too big of an issue. What can I really do? Little old me is not going to change the world, so why even try? Why is that the wrong response? And give us some 3 practical things that we can do today to better minister to children.
Sure. And I love the question, because I think one of the theological truth that children remind us of is that God has always delighted in taking the things that are small and that are weak and that are seemingly insignificant and using them for his kingdom purposes. Yeah. That's the way he's always worked, and I believe he continues to do that. It's not about us being strong enough, loud enough, forceful enough. It's about persistently doing the things he's called us to do. I have an African friend that once said that anyone who believes that something small can't make a difference has never spent a night under a mosquito net with a single mosquito. And I love that statement, because we don't have to be big to make a difference. We have to be persistent, and persistent in doing the right things. So what are some practical things that we can do? I think each of us is in circles of influence, and those start with those most close to us. As I think about children in our own families, the children that we rub shoulders with, I'd love for us to just take their ideas, their thoughts, their faith seriously. The research is consistent. Children are thinking big thoughts. They're asking big questions. They're developing lifelong ideas as children, whether we enter the conversation with them or not. I think one of our problems is that we don't always notice the big thoughts and the big questions because they're often expressed using the language of play, or they're expressed using little words, and we miss the enormity of what they're actually thinking about. So I'd love to see us get better at big thoughts, little words, instead of little thoughts, big words, which is often what we bring to children. So I think within our own spheres of influence, how do we engage children seriously within our churches? I know many in this podcast are ministry leaders, they're members of boards. I think we need to consider what it looks like to put some of our best people in children's ministry instead of seeing it purely as a training ground until people graduate to the real world of adult discipleship. A couple of years ago, a significant sized church asked me for a recommendation for a full-time paid children's ministry director in their church. And I didn't have a clear candidate to recommend in that season. A couple of months later, I asked them, so did you find somebody? And the response was, well, we found this girl. She's got experience teaching dance and she's got leadership potential. We think she's going to be great. And I find myself wondering if that same church would have ever considered hiring a senior pastor because he had experience teaching dance and had leadership potential. And yet we didn't think it was a problem to you don't need to know something to teach children. So I'm not advocating that we stop putting people in children's ministry to learn and grow, only that at least some of the people in children's ministry need to have some pretty deep biblical theological wells, and they need to know something about discipleship in the next generation.
That's powerful.
I'll get off my soapbox there.
No, that's powerful. So start with who's around you, and I love that piece of it, because when we address systemic issues, oftentimes we look beyond what's right in front of us. So how do you address it? Well, whatever stage of life you're in, whether it's your own children or whether it's grandchildren or whether it's children in a neighborhood, or God is putting it. Look, the statistics, 25% are children. So you've got children around you. So what are you doing with those opportunities? You mentioned the annual meeting and the one session, which Tim Elmore did a fabulous job of just kind of painting the picture of some of the generational elements. And I'm guilty of it. I think as adults, sometimes we're guilty of overlooking younger generations as young, inexperienced, or even being critical of their life perspective. And the challenge is, no, they're expressing felt needs. Those are real. And what are you doing about meeting those needs? And the challenge to me was, don't just dismiss the younger generation. They talked about reverse mentoring as a way to get a young person in your life that helps you understand their perspective, because they're dealing with things that we as adults never dealt with, ever. The social media impact on children is massive. And when we're not digital natives who grew up with it, we can't relate to it unless we understand it. So start with what's around you. So you said start with what's around you. You said engaging from a church context. What else? What are some other practical things we can do?
I'd love for us to be advocates, to be willing to step into long-term strategies. Mm-hmm. So we think about children and they're always a long-term proposition. The seats of power are never held by children, and we invest for a long time in the trenches. But just being willing to sow those seeds over the long term and patiently wait to see what God's going to do with them. We're often captivated by quick fixes, and children's ministry is never a quick fix for the problems that we face as God's people, but it's a necessary investment.
Yeah, and there are organizations around. You mentioned BCM as one of those. There are other organizations that are ministering to children. We have significant resource, and perhaps God is laying it on the hearts of a listener to say, hey, I can actually do something by supporting financially. I can, with those around me in the church, but then I can also give towards them. Esther, we're coming to the end. It's hard to believe 30 minutes has gone by as fast as it has. We talked globally, but bring it down to our audience of Christian and biblical higher education. What should we be doing to proactively address this issue of children's ministry?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. A few years ago, one of my older colleagues made the observation that what we teach in the seminary illustrates what we value. And it's quite a powerful statement. Where do children show up in our curriculum? Because when I talk with Bible colleges, often I hear, well, we have an elective course in children's ministry, and that's great. But the challenge of an elective course is it's taken by a handful of students, and usually those that already are convinced, and usually not those who are heading into ministry leadership roles. So I'd love for colleges to consider what would it look like to embed a required course in the curriculum that all students preparing for ministry need to take, not just those who have a niche interest in children's ministry. Another thing to consider, Bethel Seminary at the moment is looking at how do we embed children as a topic of reflection in every course that we offer at the Bible College and Seminary, that every topic we're looking at, we're asking the question, how does this impact the next generation? Where do we see God's heart for the next generation? I think we have the opportunity as we prepare the next generation of ministry leaders for the church to make a difference, but I'd love for us to be asking the question, how are we using the influence that God's given us towards the next generation?
Those are powerful questions to ask, and I would encourage listeners to ask that question of the faculty, or take a look at your curriculum. And if it's something that you truly value, then it ought to be showing up somewhere beyond just an elective course or something that's mentioned from time to time. Esther, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for sharing your heart. Thank you for sharing your passions with us today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, Philip.
Sure. And we've put a couple resources on the show description. Esther mentioned the Global Children's Forum, which is a partnering network of the WEA as well as Lausanne that are really trying to tackle this issue of children's ministry from a global perspective. So we'll put some resources in the show description that you can find out a little bit more information. And we mentioned BCM, Bible-Centered Ministries, and we'll put that in the description as well. That's an organization who's really working hard to dig deep into this space and do something about it. In fact, we have a future episode with the executive director, president of that organization, Rick Rhodes, here coming up in several weeks. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.
The Biblical Higher Ed Talk podcast is proud to be a part of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast Network. Discover even more conversations, resources, and tools to help you grow your institution at thehigheredmarketer.com, your go-to community for all things higher ed marketing and leadership.